It's fantastic to see so many refugee activists who come out today for this very important protest, to fight for the rights of refugees and asylum seekers who have been treated abominably, almost with the same atrocity that they have been running away from in Afghanistan or Sri Lanka. While the current Australian government continues to pander to xenophobia by taking a tougher line against asylum seekers, there has been a shift of sentiment in Europe towards people fleeing by boat, which is illustrated by the decision of the Italian government to declare a national day of mourning after the recent tragic loss of 366 lives at sea. As refugee rights activists, we hope that this shift grows, reversing the strong trend over the past decade of wealthier nations pushing responsibility for the protection of refugees and asylum seekers back onto poorer nations, as demonstrated by the abominable policies that Australia, both Labour and Liberal arrangements with the PNG solution and Nauru. Pope Francis described this phenomena when he visited Lampedusa in July. He warned of a culture of comfort in which we become deaf to the cries of the suffering and promote the globalization of indifference. On behalf of Labour for Refugees and activists such as yourselves, we hope that who believe that in the importance of protecting people who are fleeing persecution, we must voice our objection to the recent decision of the Australian government to refer to asylum seekers who enter Australia by boat as illegal maritime arrivals. As we all know, seeking asylum is not a crime under Australia or international law, and the Refugee Convention makes it clear that countries who are signatories, including Australia, must not impose penalties on people who arrive without authorization to seek refugee protection. This international law recognizes that very few of the world's refugees get the opportunity to cross borders with prior permission, and that rules which regulate normal migration flows must be suspended where crossing the border, where those people crossing a border believe they have a well-founded fear of persecution. The fundamental principles of the Refugee Convention are as important today as they were when they were drafted in 1951 in the wake of the Nazi Holocaust. And I happen to be Jewish, so I know. I lost aunts and uncles in Auschwitz and Dachau who were gassed in the Nazi Holocaust. Nations like Australia, which value freedom, must ensure that those fearing persecution have the opportunity to get a place of safety and have their cases for protection considered fairly. The recent report of the Australian Human Rights Commission reveals terrible problems with Australia's human rights obligations under the international law and the current treatment of asylum seekers and refugees. Australia, as you all know, has the most restrictive immigration detention system in the world. It's shame. It is mandatory, not time limited. People are not able to challenge the need for their detention in a court of law. The Human Rights Commission has for many years called for an end to this system because it leads to breaches of human rights obligations under all the international treaties to which Australia is a signatory. In September this year, there were over 6,500 people locked up in closed immigration detention facilities in Australia, including 1,428 children. Shame! As you all know, there were also 52 refugees being held in indefinite detention as a result of receiving an adverse security assessment by ASIO. The detrimental health impact of prolonged and indefinite detention is well documented by a mountain of research undertaken by psychiatrists and psychologists. In 2012-13 financial year, there were 846 reported incidents of self-harm in Australia's immigration detention network. Shame! Shame! Yeah. Therefore, we call on the Australian government to close all offshore and onshore detention centres, in particular to close Nauru and Manus Island, and Labour for Refugees and the Human Rights Commission considers that this process does not constitute a fair asylum seeking procedures of the risks. We call on the government to stop deportation of vulnerable people to danger back to the killing fields of Sri Lanka under the Rajapaksa regime, as our friend Aaron has pointed out in his speech before me. And we also are aware that the Abbott government has reintroduced temporary protection visas. There are now hundreds of people awaiting visa resolution after 4 years of waiting through no fault of their own, being locked up and now enduring after enduring long-term detention. Under the Abbott government, no asylum seeker who is granted a TPV can ever get a permanent visa. Why such cruelty? Labour for Refugees is calling on the Labour opposition to oppose the reintroduction of TPVs by voting with the Greens against this vile regulation in the Senate. Just to wrap up, we call on the Abbott government to respect all the international treaties that Australia is a signatory to, and to allow asylum seekers their human rights to work and study while their claims are being assessed, so that they can contribute to the economy, retain their skills, and have the liberty of movement. The Australian government does have a choice. It can listen to the most strident voices in Australian society and continue to implement harsh and punitive policies of deterrence, or it can place a much higher value on justice, fairness, human rights and compassion. We call on the government and the Labour opposition to take the better path for the good of our nation and for the sake of vulnerable and traumatized people fleeing persecution, torture and killing. Thank you, everyone.